Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight for Round and Round, How to Shake and Stir Classic Cocktails. My name is Megan, and I'm a Programs and Exhibits Specialist at the Arlington Heights Memorial Library, and I'm joined today by my colleague Carol, who will be helping us out with the behind-the-scenes stuff. For more programs to keep you entertained and informed, visit our programs calendar at ahml.info. And our next culinary program is Fiesta Holiday Cooking Demo on Thursday, December 3rd. And now, I'm very excited and honored to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Dr. Kevin Peterson, co-owner of the fragrant cocktail bar Castalia, located in Detroit, Michigan. With a background in physics, engineering, and the culinary world, Kevin combines all three and adds his own creativity to bring an experience and knowledge unlike any other cocktail bar. Having done interviews in various magazines and podcasts, Kevin and Castalia stand above the rest, not to mention Castalia appearing on many, many must-visit lists. Kevin, thank you for joining us, and with that, I will be turning it over to you.
All right, well, thanks for having me. This is awesome. So my name's Kevin. I started my working life in the food world. So I cooked in kitchens. I went to culinary school. I thought I was going to be a chef someday. The closer I got, the more I became a little disenchanted with that world of sort of high-end culinary. And I actually switched paths at some point in there and became an engineer, which is what brought me to Detroit. I worked for automotive companies for about a decade, but I never lost sight of my passion for flavors, and eventually that took sort of the version of both becoming very interested in scents. So my wife and I started a fragrance company called Sfumato, whose shirt I'm wearing right now. And when we opened our store, which I am currently in, we built it so that it could be both a retail store for the scents by day and a cocktail bar by night. And now all of the drinks that we serve are paired to the different scents. So what I'm going to go over today is more cocktail stuff than scent stuff, but we'll touch on that a little bit. If you have questions on that, feel free to jump in. Let me actually give you a little tour of my store and bar before we get into the main program here. So the store was built so that it could transform. So we've got these display cases that are actually on hinges. I'm not actually going to disassemble it right now, but the idea is that this is more or less day mode. When we go into cocktail mode, all that stuff on the table could go into the cabinet. We could shut the doors down and then use those tables, pull some chairs out of the back and seat customers there. So we've got some little corner seating, a nice little patio outside. I've got some messy workspace area here too that I will not show you, but yeah. Now figure out how to turn my camera back. All right. And you'll notice I placed one rum bottle at each edge of the screen so that I can orient myself here. All right. So we're going to go over two drinks today. We're going to go over an old fashioned, which is a stirred drink, and we're going to go over a daiquiri, which is a shaken drink. And what I really want to focus on is, I'm assuming most of you are not, that bowl is not for me. Probably most of you are not working in bars. If you are, probably some of this is going to be review, but you want to learn some stuff too. So there's three big things to consider when you're making a cocktail. The first one is the ingredients, and this is something that most people get right, although there are a couple little nuances to be aware of. So when I'm making cocktails, you really don't need the most expensive spirit. If you're spending more than $50 or more than $100 on a bottle, I think of those more expensive bottles as kind of works of art in their own right. When I'm spending that much on a bottle, I'm not thinking of that as cocktails. I'm thinking of that as something that I'm probably going to sit and eat, maybe in the art world, the analogy could be, you know, if you purchased the Mona Lisa, you don't need to add a lot of ornamentation around it. Like it's already sufficient on its own. If you're paying, I realize there's a difference between a $100 bottle of Scotch and Mona Lisa, but if you are buying, you know, a more expensive spirit that's kind of a work of art in its own right, a lot of what cocktails were designed for and where they got their origin was in covering the flaws of maybe not poorly made, but say less than ideally made spirits. And to that end, sometimes when I'm making a cocktail, I want the rough edges of a spirit. So for me, a lot of times that's bottles that are somewhere between 20 and 30 bucks. If you go below 20, you know, you might still find some winners, but that's where you get into the really rough stuff. So usually, you know, a lot of the spirits that I'm using are between 20 and $30. So the first thing we're going to talk about is some of the ingredients. The second thing, which is key, is the ratios. So cocktails are entirely a game of ratios. How many parts spirit, how many parts citrus juice, how many parts sweetener. Actually, while I'm talking, if you are near an electric tea kettle or a stove, put a little bit of water on to boil, like half a cup, a cup. You don't need more than that. One of the ingredients we're going to talk about today is simple syrup, so I'm going to hit go on my electric kettle. So we've got ingredients, we've got ratios, and then we've got technique. Now, if you're reading a recipe off the internet, probably you're going to get the ingredients right because it's going to tell you what to buy. Okay, buy an orange, buy some sugar, buy some honey, buy some whiskey. And then the recipe probably has the ratios in there. 2 ounces of whiskey to a half ounce of citrus to a half ounce of sweetener. But where a lot of people fail to optimize the cocktail is in the technique. There's some simple tricks with the technique that can help you optimize your drinks. But even more than that, knowing what the technique is supposed to accomplish is something that a lot of people maybe have never thought about or never studied. And if you just have a little bit more conceptual background in why you would shake or why you would stir, that will probably be enough to help you really get there. And I'm going to give you some simple tricks to really optimize your shaking. So let's start with making some simple syrup. Now, simple syrup is an interesting ingredient because every bar has this behind them. There's always a bottle, you know, somewhere in the back bar, somewhere in the fridge of simple syrup. Almost no one at home has simple syrup. It's weird. I have never really played with simple syrup, you know, briefly in the culinary world, but until I started being regularly on this side of the bar, I didn't play much with simple syrup. It truly is simple. Now, when I'm making it in the bar, I make it with a culinary scale. So simple syrup is just equal parts sugar and water. Now, the reason that I weigh my simple syrup, so you can say, okay, equal parts. Well, does that mean equal parts by mass, like 100 grams of sugar and 100 grams of water? Or does that mean equal parts by volume? You know, 3 tablespoons of sugar and 3 tablespoons of water. If you're doing this at home, it doesn't really matter. If you're just making a couple drinks for yourself, you make one, oh, this needs to be a little bit more sweet. Okay, you can just add a little bit more sweetness. For me, working in a bar, I'm making hundreds of drinks a night. I need that repeatability, and mass is a more repeatable measure than volume. But in case you don't have a scale at home, and what I'm going to be doing is doing a lot of these techniques, not the way I do them in the bar, but the way I would do them if I was at home, or especially if I was at someone else's home and I was scrounging through their kitchen and saying, okay, you know, I would really love to use a jigger. This is what I use behind the bar. This is a very quick, convenient way of measuring liquids. If I'm at my sister's house, who's not a bartender, she definitely has a measuring spoon. She may not have a jigger, but you know, I can get by with measuring spoons. Whoops, they fall apart sometimes, but they're pretty instructive. So what I'm going to do is measure out some simple syrup. And the way that I'm going to do this is equal parts sugar and water. We're going to use the simple syrup in both the old-fashioned and the daiquiri. So I'm going to make a little bit extra. And what I'm going to do is measure out 4 tablespoons of sugar, A little more. And then I'm going to measure 4 tablespoons of boiling water. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the sugar that I'm using is called turbinado sugar. It's a little bit of a less refined sugar, meaning it's got more of the molasses notes from the sugar cane in it. You can use white sugar. You can even use honey. You can even use maple syrup. There are a variety of sweeteners you can use, but for all of them, I just approach it in a standard way. It's always equal parts sweetener and hot water. Now, you could use cold water. The sugar would dissolve eventually. The hot water is just going to help everything dissolve more quickly. And it's that act of dissolving that is key here. So on the one hand, I could just spoon the sugar into my drink or into my shaker as I'm stirring it up. The risk is that the sugar may not dissolve by the time I drink the drink. Creating a syrup ahead of time just removes that possibility. Sugar's already dissolved. You're not going to wind up with either gritty stuff at the bottom of your drink or if you put a half a tablespoon in and some of that doesn't dissolve, it's not sweetening the drink. It's just sitting at the bottom of your glass, so your drink is not as sweet as you intended it to be. So it just kind of throws everything off. So that is 4 tablespoons of sugar, 4 tablespoons of boiling water. I'm going to give that a stir. Of course, I use fancy cocktail spoons to do the stirring, but a soup spoon or a tablespoon or whatever will definitely do the trick. I'm going to give that a stir for a minute. Let that dissolve. I'll give it another stir, and then everything should pretty well come together. Now, while we're doing that, let's get the setup ready for our old-fashioned. The old-fashioned is lovely to make at home because you make it right in the glass. There's no other dishes. Like, it's just, if you were going to cook dinner and you were like, well, I need a pan and I need a spatula and I need this and that. So you're like, well, what if I could cook dinner just on my plate? What if my plate was the thing I cooked it on? That's basically what the old-fashioned is in the cocktail. You just make everything in the glass, then you pick up the glass and drink it. It's beautiful. All right, so I've got a rocks glass. Now, on the one hand, there's a lot of tradition and there's a lot of sort of, oh, what drink should be served in this glass or that glass? If you're working in a high-end cocktail bar, yeah, you should probably consider those things. If you're drinking at home, not quite such a big deal. If someone wants me to follow up on this more, I will, but I'll just mention a couple of the big considerations with glassware. One, how much does it weigh? So that determines how much heat it can hold and how much it's going to change the temperature of the drink when you put the drink in the glass. The other big consideration is how much room is there on top of the glass, meaning the surface area. So if I put the same amount of liquid into a champagne flute or a rocks glass, this has a much smaller surface area. So if there's bubbles in here, the bubbles are going to escape more slowly because they have less area to escape from. If I put champagne in this glass, the bubbles would escape very quickly because there's a larger surface area. So I'm going to use a rocks glass, and then I'm going to use a big ice cube. Now, these are roughly 2 by 2, 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches. I'm going to drop that in. So the way that I make ice cubes here is I freeze a giant picnic cooler full of water. And what that does is it allows the water to freeze slowly enough that all of the air bubbles get pushed to the bottom. And I wind up with perfectly clear ice on top. Now, perfectly clear ice chills and dilutes in exactly the same way that cloudy ice does. Clear ice is really just a way for bartenders to impress each other or to judge each other. If I go to someone's bar and their ice is cloudy, I'm like, cloudy ice, amateurs. If you're doing this at home, you know, you're only judging yourself, or maybe your spouse is judging you, which is a pretty severe form of judgment. But it's not critical to the execution of the drink. If you're at home, you can use something like these bigger silicone molds. So this will make 4 big ice cubes. That's going to be lovely for drinking old fashions at home. So now I've got my rocks glass. I've got my ice cube in there.
Hey, Kevin, can I ask a question of you?
Yes.
How come you use a bigger ice cube for an old fashioned?
That is a wonderful question. So the 3 big things that people don't consider when they're making drinks, but they should, are temperature, dilution, and aeration. And that's the key to technique, why you would shake, why you would stir, why you would serve in a bigger glass or a smaller glass. And so the key to a big ice cube is, you know, if I used a number of small ice cubes, there would be a lot more surface area. So a lot more of the cocktail would be in contact with the ice, and the ice would tend to melt more quickly. So depending on what dilution ratio I want in that drink, I might be over diluting my drink more quickly with a bunch of small ice cubes compared to 1 big ice cube. So the point of the big ice cube is to slow some of that melting and dilution. You know, the other way that you could do this, like say if you're at home and you only have small ice, what I would actually recommend is put a bunch of small ice cubes in there, make your drink, stir it up, but then actually strain it out into a different glass so that that small ice doesn't continue to melt into the drink. But yeah, you know, largely it's an aesthetic factor, but there is this kind of physics thermodynamics answer to it. Okay, so now the way the ingredients in an old fashioned, very simple, there's 3 ingredients. So it's bitters, it's sweetener, and it's whiskey. So the ratios that I like to use are 2 ounces of whiskey, 1/4 ounce of syrup, and 3 dashes of bitters. Now, these are probably the most iconic bitters. I'll try to get in the right spot on the light there. Angostura bitters, the yellow cap, the label doesn't quite fit right. You know, you've likely seen these behind tons of bars. Even if bars don't really focus on cocktails, they probably have a bottle of this somewhere behind the bar. These are classic, iconic, delicious. They also have artificial food coloring in them. So I've got a bottle here in case people request it, but usually I actually make my own bitters. I buy all the kind of weird barks and roots and herbs, and I extract them with hydrochloric alcohol. For the sake of this home demo, I'm going to use the Angostura. So I'm going to do 3 dashes here into the glass. 1, 2, 3. And now again, this doesn't matter so much when you're making drinks at home. In a bar setting, the tradition often is to add drinks from the least expensive to the most expensive. You know, so that was probably 5 cents worth of bitters or something like that. It's a little bit of an expensive bottle, but it's such a tiny amount that it winds up being pretty cheap. Next up, I'm going to do the sweetener. And the rationale for going cheapest to most expensive is that if you mess something up and you have to throw it away, you're throwing away less money if you build from cheap to expensive than if you build from cheap to cheap. So now I've got my sweetener here. I'm going to do half a tablespoon. So the ratio is 8 to 1, 8 parts whiskey to 1 part sweetener. I'm going to do a half a tablespoon of simple syrup, and then 4 tablespoons of the whiskey. the way that I would typically write that recipe or talk about that recipe with other bartenders is 2 ounces of whiskey and a 1/4 ounce of sweetener. But just to make this a little easier for folks at home, there is half a tablespoon of syrup. Spoon. Sticky little drips of simple syrup are basically the bane of my existence. Try to avoid spreading them too casually. Now 4 tablespoons of whiskey. I'm using Maker's Mark. You know, this is a classic Kentucky bourbon. Bourbon is a type of whiskey. Whiskey is the parent category. Bourbon is a subsection of the whiskey family. Scotch is a subsection of the whiskey family. Rye is a subsection of the whiskey family. All right, so now in my glass, I've got a big ice cube. I've got 3 dashes of bitters, half a tablespoon of simple syrup, and 4 tablespoons of whiskey. So now I'm going to give that a stir for about 15 seconds. So now, like I was mentioning to Megan, temperature, dilution, and aeration are keys to the cocktail. Most cocktails are consumed somewhere between about 25 Fahrenheit and 35 Fahrenheit. And if you just throw ice in there, let everything kind of chill down, you come to about that temperature. If you drink it too warm, the issue is that your taste buds are temperature dependent. So for example, your sweet taste buds are much more sensitive hot than they are cold. If you ever try, say, eating ice cream after it's melted and warmed up, it is cloyingly, disgustingly sweet. If you drink a can of Coke that's been sitting out on your counter all day and it's room temp, gross. The balance is totally off. It's way too sweet. Chill it down to fridge temperature or to ice cream temperature, and now all of a sudden, like, the balance is exactly right. It's the right level of sweet. You know, it's delicious. Same thing with a cocktail. If it's served too warm, the balance is going to be off. It's going to taste too sweet or too something. It's going to be wrong. You need to get it to the right temperature. You also need to get the right amount of water into it. The interesting thing with stirring and shaking is that adding the water, so I'm not actually taking, you know, a glass of water and pouring water in. The water that I'm adding is coming from ice that's melting. As that ice cube melts, that ice turns into water, it incorporates into the drink, and I'm diluting the drink some. At the same time that the ice cube is melting, that is what is drawing the temperature down as well. So, you know, on the one hand, if you were in school and you got handed this physics problem or this thermodynamics problem, what is the final temperature? How much water are you adding? This and that, calculate the thermodynamics of the cocktail. It would be very complex. Luckily, it's kind of idiot-proofed for my sake, for your sake, for all of our sakes. If you just stir for 15 seconds, you come out at the right temp, you come out at the right dilution. It's easy. So let's take a sip. Right on. That is a delicious old fashioned. Now, the way that I serve this in my bar is that I pair my drinks with scents. Now, I'm assuming this is not a step that you're going to do at home, but I make fragrances based on different herbs, different spices, different culinary combinations. So this one here that I'm spraying is based on coriander, cardamom, and nutmeg. There's some vanilla notes in here as well. It just so happens that a lot of the same molecules that give coriander, cardamom, nutmeg, and vanilla their flavors are the exact same molecules that arise when wood starts to decompose. Where does whiskey spend about, 2 to 4 or 5 years of its life? In a wooden barrel. So while the whiskey's sitting in that barrel, it's pulling those baking spice and vanilla notes out of the wood. I'm pulling those same flavors out of the actual baking spices. And now I'm putting them together and saying, okay, here we've got a scent, we've got a taste, or flavor. If we smell and drink at the same time, that's adding another level of appreciation and complexity to the drink. You know, what your brain is doing is saying, okay, what input am I getting from my tongue? What input am I getting from air coming in my nose? What input am I getting from air coming up the back of my throat when I swallow? Putting all these things together to say, okay, what exactly is happening? What am I eating? What am I drinking? And so what I'm doing is with the scent, I'm adding a little more complexity to that process and saying, okay, brain, I got a little extra something for you here. Adding this scent, and my brain is saying, okay, I guess I have to incorporate this added input. This whole stimulus that I'm now trying to comprehend is just a touch more complicated than I thought. So that is the old-fashioned, probably the most iconic and definitely the most ordered drink at this bar. Let me pause and sip some water, and if there are any questions on old fashions or whiskeys or life in general, happy to take a few.
Yeah, so we do have a couple questions. First, we have a comment that says that you just, this is someone's favorite drink after work, and you just made them feel like a pro now. So thank you for that. We do have a question about how you cut the ice out of your cooler.
Yes, good question. I would demo it for you, but it's actually kind of a long process. So I pop it out. Well, I'm trying to think of what I can use to sort of demo this here. So here's my block of ice. So I pop it out of the cooler. When it's at freezer temperature, ice is very brittle. If I smacked it with a hammer, or if I kind of tried to chop it or something, all these little shards would come off. The interesting thing is that if I let it warm up to about 31 Fahrenheit or just below where it starts to melt, the fracture dynamics change. So once I let it, so the way I would do this in the bar is I would come in early, I'd pop it out, I'd let it sit on the counter probably for an hour, hour and a half. And at that point, I would take a bread knife and I would score a little line on the top. Try to demo this without setting my books in water. So the way that I would do this is I would chop, or I would kind of score a line on top with the bread knife, and then I'd give it a smack with the hammer. This is the most zen prep job. The crack propagates straight through. You give it a smack and this straight line propagates all the way through the block, and this perfectly rectangular block just kind of falls over. And so yeah, it's a super fun job. Definitely check out a YouTube video. Dave Arnold is one of my favorite authors. He's got some YouTube videos showing how to chop ice. But yeah, that's how we do it.
That's really cool. We have a question. Do bourbons have to come from the state of Kentucky to be called a true bourbon?
They do not. So bourbon is probably the hottest category in existence right now. And a lot of spirits come down to very boring definitions from the TTB. The TTB used to be the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. I forget what TTB stands for. It's like Tax and Trade Bureau or something really boring. But basically, there are all these kind of legal definitions, and it's like, okay, it must be 51% or suburban, 51% corn. It must be distilled to, let's see, no greater than 160 proof. It must be bottled at no less than 80 proof. There are all these stipulations in there. Coming from Kentucky is not one of the stipulations. Kentucky is most known for bourbon, but bourbon can come from anywhere in the U.S. Now, it does have to come from the U.S. So Canada can't make bourbon, Mexico can't make bourbon, Europe can't make bourbon. And yeah, it's the interesting thing about those TTB qualifications is that on the one hand, they're very specific in how they're written and how you have to treat them if you're a distiller. The funny part is that there's a huge range of flavors that can be achieved within the bounds of the TTB definition. So actually, for the next drink, I'm going to talk about how widely rums can vary. They're all rums. They're all made from sugar cane. Depending on the yeast and depending on how it's fermented, you can get this one. This one tastes like a banana. You know, if you smell this, you'd be like, "Oh, who just like peeled a banana?" Whereas this one smells more like butterscotch and maple syrup, and it's like, what? They're both the exact same category. It's totally weird. So that was a long answer to a short question. Bourbon can come from anywhere in the U.S.
That's really cool. And then we do have one more question. What brand or flavor of bitters would you buy from a store if you had to?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like 20 or 30 years ago, there were not many bitters brands. There were these guys, Angostura, maybe a handful of others. Now there's hundreds or thousands of varieties, and probably most craft cocktail bars are making their own. You know, these are weird kind of amber bottles, pardon my unprofessional masking tape label. One of my favorite brands is Bitter Cube. They are out of Milwaukee. They don't have any artificial flavors, artificial dyes. So that's one thing I would look for. This is something you probably want to have in your bar if you're kind of an aspiring cocktail aficionado. Brands are not required to disclose every ingredient. You're allowed to keep some things secret, like for trade secret purposes. But in general, you have to disclose if there are artificial flavors or colors. So that would be my first cut is, and this is something I like to do. If I'm at a weird kind of liquor store somewhere else and they have a bunch of bitters, yeah, I'll poke through them and you find root beer bitters and you find chocolate bitters and spicy mole bitters. Like, there's a lot of people doing fun stuff in the bitters realm. The first cut I would do is just read it and say, okay, is there anything artificial in here? And I tend to lean away from the artificial stuff. But yeah, kind of an aromatic bitters, which is what Angostura is considered. That's going to be your most sort of, this can go in anything. This can make an old fashioned Manhattan, whatever. Then there are a lot of specialty bitters beyond that. So Bitter Cube, Angostura, or an aromatic bitters. And then if you've got those in your collection already, just go nuts, buy weird stuff.
And I lied, we do have one more question. So we have a couple of people who are very interested in your scents. Do you ship outside of Michigan? And is that just available on your website?
Yep. So the website for the scent company is sfumatofragrances.com. That's SFUMATO fragrances.com. Sfumato is an Italian word that means to turn to smoke or turn to vapor. So you spray the scent and it turns to vapor. We ship everywhere in the lower 48 and great time for the holidays. Thanks for asking.
All right, thank you.
Let me get one more sip of this old fashioned and then let's make the daiquiri.
Oh, while you're sipping, we do have another. Can an old fashioned be made with Scotch?
Yeah, it definitely can. So on the one hand, it depends on who you're asking. Some people take their definitions very literally. But even if someone takes their definition very literally, the roots of the phrase old fashioned are a little bit shrouded in history. So So I think of an old fashioned as a category. I think of it as a spirit forward category where my basic ratios stay the same. 2 ounces of spirit, 1/4 ounce of sweetener, 3 dashes of bitters. If I'm using mole bitters or orange bitters or root beer bitters or whatever, it's still an old fashioned in my mind. If I'm using sugar or honey or maple syrup or agave, it's still an old fashioned. If I'm using rum or bourbon or scotch or gin, it's still an old fashioned in my mind. Now, say 10 or 15 years ago, there was a lot more pretension in the cocktail world, and depending on which venues you frequent, you may find more or less of that. I'm more inclined to be like, look, everybody, let's just find something that works for us. You like scotch? Yeah, I'll make you a scotch old fashioned. You want a scotch daiquiri? You know, maybe daiquiri is not quite the right word anymore, but yeah, let's make you a scotch daiquiri. You know, there are some people that say, well, this recipe was written in 1936, and this is exactly how it has to be made, and this is the only way to make it. That's not my approach. So yeah, if there's a spirit that you're into, the interesting thing about the ratio system is that, you know, you can swap out different spirits, and as long as you're adding the same quantity and those ratios stay the same, that drink is still going to be fairly balanced. So it's a fun way to try new combinations or maybe come up with your own sort of house drink or your house specialties, is to take an existing classic, keep the amounts or keep the ratios exactly the same, but swap out one spirit for another one or one sweetener for another one. That actually has a technical term called Mr. Potato Heading. So you've got your here's your Mr. Potato Head doll. He's got the googly eyes, he's got the the bulbous nose and the mustache mouth. So the idea with Mr. Potato Heading is you take off the googly eyes and you put the sunglass eyes on. You know, it still looks like a face, but it's a different face now. If you take out the whiskey and you add in gin, we call it Mr. Potato Heading gin in for whiskey. And again, you've still got a composed face, it's just a different face now. Maybe one that you like more, maybe one that you like less.
Cool. So we do have other questions. However, for the sake of time, I am going to let you start on this next drink. I do see your questions, everyone, and the next break, I will make sure to get to them.
Yeah, I just checked the clock. Holy crap, time flew.
Yeah, time flies, man.
I'm gonna make this drink. I don't have other plans. Yeah, my wife is probably gonna want to see me at some point tonight, but I'm happy to stay on the line and answer questions. I love talking about cocktails. I talk about them all day. I've been talking about them all day for years, and I'm still not sick of it. So let me make a daiquiri to keep me company while I answer more questions, and we'll go from there. So a daiquiri is a very classic, iconic shaken. Now, like I said, the three big things to consider with technique are temperature, dilution, and aeration. Now, temperature and dilution were important to an old-fashioned. Oops, strip in there. But we didn't aerate it at all. Part of the reason we didn't aerate it is, one, it's not traditional and it's not what people are expecting. But two, there's not much in an old-fashioned that would be able to capture the air bubbles. So there's not a whole lot of point to aerating. When we shake a drink, and of course, if I were in the bar, I would use a cocktail shaker set. So these are just two metal tins. You kind of smack them together and you can put the drink in there. For the sake of at-home users, I'm going to use a Tupperware. You know, these things cost whatever, 15 cents. They totally function perfectly well as a shaker. Now, when you're shaking up a drink, one of the things that you're doing is incorporating a lot of air into the liquid of the cocktail. Citrus juice has enough longer molecules, proteins and such, that they can actually trap air within the matrix of the liquid. So after I give this a shake, I'll zoom in on the surface of the glass, and you will see air bubbles. Now, a more traditional way to serve a shaken drink is a coupe glass. So this glass, again, has a wide surface area. One thing that allows that to do is all of those bubbles that you shook into the drink, it allows them to come to the surface and pop, which you actually want because they release aroma as they're popping. So when you lift that drink to your mouth, you get this nice burst of aroma that enhances the flavor. So I'm going to put that in a coupe. And the ratios for a daiquiri are 4 parts spirit, 1 part citrus, 1 part sweet. So, you know, in terms of actual ounces, that would be 2 ounces of spirit, 1/2 ounce of sweetener, 1/2 ounce of citrus juice. Now there are tools you can buy. You know, you can use a squeezer like this. There are even bigger versions or electric versions of a similar idea. If you're just drinking at home and you're just making one, you can just use your hands. You know, there's a lot more concern around sanitary things. Obviously, if I was doing this for customers, I would be using my hands, or I hope it's obvious. All right. Let's try to keep up. Most of his goodies. Now, let me just see where I'm at in terms of volume. I'm going for 1 tablespoon. A little bit short, so I'll just squeeze the other half in here. A lot of times you'll see home recipes written as like the juice of 1 lime. It's not very precise, but if you're just drinking at home, the key is if you take a sip and it's too sour, you just take your simple syrup and you add another tiny dash. So I don't love recipes that are written that way, but for the sake of home bartending, they're totally adequate. You know, in the bar, we're much more precise about it. All right, so now I've got perfect 1 tablespoon of my citrus. Add 1 tablespoon of my syrup. And then 4 tablespoons of rum. And what I was going to mention with rum is that rum is, the legal definition is that it's fermented from a sugarcane spirit, and that it's bottled at no less than 80 proof. That's a fairly wide definition. It's also made in all different kinds of countries all around the world. This one's from Jamaica, this one's from India. Depending on how close to the equator you are, or which country, you tend to get different profiles. One of the big ones to be aware of is Jamaican rum. Jamaican tends to be the most funky and the most fruity. If you're into that, there's an amazing world of exploration. If you're not, I would stick to basically any country except Jamaica. So this rum is actually from India. It's called Old Monk. Rum is also a fun category to play with because right now, rums are cheap. Bourbons and whiskeys used to be cheap, but they're really popular right now. And the price has gone up dramatically in the last 5 or 10 years. You can still find a quality, like sippable, good bottle of rum for $20, $25, maybe even $15. It's hard to do that in the whiskey world these days. Okay, so now in my professional quality shaker, I've got 4 tablespoons or 2 ounces of rum, 1 tablespoon or 1/2 ounce of lime, and 1 tablespoon or 1/2 ounce of syrup. I'm going to add some ice cubes. Now, when you're shaking a drink, I usually add 6 or 7 ice cubes. It's possible to add too few. I don't recommend you add a ton, but it's less critical if you add too many because you're straining everything out. That ice doesn't sit in the glass and overdilute the drink. Some of the cocktail does stick to the surface of the ice, so you wind up wasting a little bit of cocktail, but whatever comes through is still at the right proportions. The big thing with shaking, you have to shake it much longer than you think you're supposed to. To get everything to the right temperature, dilution, and aeration, the number you want to remember is 12 seconds. People think the point of shaking is just to mix everything up. Okay, it's fully mixed. I'm done. No, you're not done. 12 seconds. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, there's 12 seconds. Lid off. And now when I pour this, you're going to see all of these bubbles in the drink. Obviously, I hope you will. Grab the camera here. So we got all these bubbles on top of the drink. There's many more sort of microscopic and not visible bubbles inside the liquid as well. Now we've got shaken, chilled, diluted, and aerated. That is delightful. The scent that I would pair with that is called Nijananda. Nijananda is based on sandalwood, ginger, and jasmine, so it's got some of these tropical notes to kind of pair with the daiquiri. All right. Now, successfully made 2 cocktails. Let's see if I can successfully drink them. Yeah, so just to maybe quickly summarize a couple of the key things. Ingredients. Spend at least $20 on your bottles of booze. Don't spend more than 50, even 40 might be pushing it. Citrus, you want citrus to be fresh. Within about a day, citrus gets weird and bitter and gross. Squeeze your citrus fresh. Simple syrup is actually simple. I suggest you make it at home. It stays good for a couple of weeks. Once you see things starting to grow and float in the bottom, pitch it. Luckily, sugar is cheap, so you might be only, even if you have to throw away your whole batch, you're out 30 cents or something. It's not terrible. So we've got ingredients, we've got ratios. So whether you're measuring tablespoons or something else, the more professional measurement is a jigger. And then the last key is technique. And when you're thinking about technique, you're thinking about dilution, aeration, and temperature. Stir for 15 seconds, shake for 12 seconds, it'll be golden. All right, thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Happy to take questions, everybody.
Excellent, thank you so much. So we are at time, so if anybody does have to leave, our program is officially over, but Kevin has already said that he is more than willing to keep talking about cocktails. So if you have time, we've got time. So a couple questions have come in. What is your favorite cocktail right now? Is there anything in particular that you've been especially enjoying?
Yeah, I've been playing with sake as a cocktail ingredient. So I've been playing a little bit more with lower ABV cocktails. So instead of using a 80 or 100 proof spirit, sake is a rice wine that's usually more like 15 or 20% alcohol. And yeah, I'm finding kind of the more delicate flavors, maybe more floral flavors to be pretty intriguing. Old fashioned is still my iconic go-to. If I'm at a bar and I don't trust the bartenders, there's a drink called a Boulevardier, which is equal parts whiskey, vermouth, and Campari. So it's kind of a bittersweet drink, and it's almost impossible to screw up. So those are kind of where my long-term interests and my current sort of future-facing interests are at.
Nice. What is the difference between an old-fashioned and a Manhattan?
So a Manhattan has vermouth in it, which I don't know if I have a bottle I can grab right here. Vermouth is a fortified and aromatized wine. So it's a wine that's, closer to 15 or 20, maybe 25% alcohol, but then there's a bunch of herbs and spices that are infused into it. So it winds up being this kind of more complex, deeper, darker ingredient. And yeah, a traditional build for a Manhattan would be 2 parts of rye whiskey. This isn't rye, and 1 part of vermouth, and then a few dashes. So they're both spirit-forward drinks. By all visual appearances, they're more or less identical, but they hit the tongue a little bit different.
Thank you. How much simple syrup did you put into the daiquiri?
Half ounce.
Half ounce.
So 2 ounces of rum or 2 ounces of spirit, half ounce citrus, half ounce sweetener.
Thank you. And then one last question in here. Why is your simple syrup so dark?
That is because I'm using an unrefined sugar. So if it's fully refined, it's white sugar, and this would be almost clear. This is only partially refined, so there's more traces of molasses in here, which is what gives it the color. It gives it a little deeper flavor and more complex flavor, which I appreciate. So this sugar is a little bit more expensive, but I find it to be a worthwhile investment in the flavor.
All right, thank you very much. It looks like that was the end of our questions. As I say that, 2 more just like flew in. So here we go. Is a quote Wisconsin old fashioned just when brandy is used instead of whiskey or bourbon?
Yeah. I grew up in Minnesota, and the old fashions that my family drank, I didn't know it at the time, but so the issue is there's this other category of drink. There's old fashions, and then there's Wisconsin old fashions. The issue is that people in Wisconsin don't call them Wisconsin old fashions. They just call them old fashions. The difference is that the old fashioned is fairly bitter and booze forward, whereas the Wisconsin old fashioned is much more fruity, sweet, and just has a lot more stuff in it. So where kind of the craft cocktail old fashioned is an exercise in simplicity, the Wisconsin old fashioned is an exercise in something else. You're going to muddle some of those like fluorescent red maraschino cherries in there, maybe an orange slice. You might top it with Squirt or 7-Up. Brandy is probably going to be the spirit of choice rather than whiskey or bourbon. So it's basically 2 different drinks that unfortunately happen to have the exact same name. And Wisconsin old fashions are kind of frowned upon in the more pretentious realms of the craft cocktail world. I still drink one after my shift every once in a while because I'm actually nostalgic for my grandpa giving me a sip of one when I was a kid or something. Yes, 2 different drinks, same name.
Very nice. And then it looks like this might actually be our last question. I keep saying that and then we get more. But did you mention what your PhD is in?
I did not. My studies, my undergrad was physics and my PhD was mechanical engineering. And that was done with the intention of becoming a combustion engineer, which I did for a number of years. But what it strangely wound up doing was teaching me a lot about thermodynamics. How does ice work? How does shaking work? How does drinking work? And it taught me a lot about signal processing. And that's another thing I've taken into the cocktail realm, where I look at this as your taste buds are little measuring devices. your olfactory receptors are little measuring devices. They pick up on the sugar, the salt, the bitterness, whatever that's in the drink, and they send signals into your brain, and then your brain kind of compares all these signals and computes, how much do I like this? How intense is the flavor? What exactly am I drinking? And so I've been able to take a lot of that signal processing framework and sort of rework it for the cocktail world. And that's part of the reason that I do the scent strip. So normally when you take a sip, you're getting, things are evaporating off of your cocktail and going into your nose. And the very similar things are evaporating in your mouth and going up the back of your throat. And your brain, what your brain actually treats those as two separate signals. It's the same, or they're hitting the same receptors, but depending on which way the airflow is going, your brain treats those signals differently. So that's part of the motivation to add the scent, is that now we're basically hacking that signal and sort of tricking your brain into appreciating this extra level of things.
Very good. And then for the sake of time, we will just do one more question. So I'm so sorry to everybody else who is coming up with questions. They're all great. I will include all of the information that we've talked about in the follow-up email.
Before you close it, Megan,
Yes.
I'll answer the question, but there were a couple of books that I wanted to mention.
Of course, yes.
Okay, so let's take the question and I'll talk about it.
Of course. What temperature does the simple syrup need to be at before you're adding it to the cocktail?
That's a good question. Usually I keep it refrigerated. Yeah, it was definitely at an elevated temperature for the demo tonight. And what that's going to mean is that I melted a little bit more ice than I intended to, and the dilution of the drink was a little bit higher than I intended it to be. The most important thing, rather than shooting for a specific temperature, is to do it consistently. So the easiest way to hit that consistency is to just keep your simple syrup in the fridge, and then it's always at fridge temp, which is somewhere around 35 F, and you're always making drinks the same way. It's you can follow a recipe and you can get the drink pretty close, but like when I'm coming up with new drinks, there's almost always a little bit of, oh man, this really just needs a little dash of this, a little dash of that. There's always a little bit of correction that happens. And so you want to be able to make that correction, but over time, you want to be able to say, okay, this is exactly how I made it last time. I'm just going to do it exactly the same way this time. So yeah, fridge temp is what I would recommend. Okay, and those 5 books. Actually here, as I'm talking about the books, let me also point out that this is my personal collection of cocktail and smell books. There's maybe 100 of them here. There's 50 more that I sell, and then I've got the rest of my collection at home. So yeah, most people learn how to make cocktails by working at a cocktail bar. I mostly learned about this by reading books about it. Essence and Alchemy is the best overview of sort of natural and niche perfumery. There's not much, or there's not anything about cocktails in this book, but it's just an interesting view of flavors and scents and how that part of your brain works. The 2 best intro books for cocktails, either Death and Company, which is a bar in New York, or PDT, which is another bar in New York. These are both kind of like, they're written for entry-level people, but they're deep enough that even if you've been in this world for a while, even I reread these books and I still find little details and I'm like, okay, yeah, I never quite thought about it that way. That's an interesting trick to have to try. Imbibe is one of the books that's credited with kicking off the craft cocktail revolution. This is a book about the guy that wrote the first cocktail book. So this book was written, I forget, in the late 90s, early 2000s, but it was about a guy who lived in the mid 1800s and who wrote kind of the first cocktail book. And so this is a great piece of history, a lot of interesting stuff about both pre-prohibition cocktails and modern day. This book is intensely nerdly. This is the kind of book I had to read like 4 pages at a time because it's so dense. You just need like to read that much and then take a break. But this is the book that describes how does your brain take taste bud input, olfactory input, put it all together and create a flavor. And then the last one is my favorite, liquid intelligence. This is the scientists, the science of the cocktail. How do you use liquid nitrogen? How do you carbonate? How do you make clear ice? What temperature does a drink come down when you shake it? All of that info. Reading that book for me, I read that book when I was an engineer and I had no intention of opening a cocktail bar. I read that book and I was like, holy crap, there's a whole world out here I didn't realize was there that is fascinating. So that book is the reason I'm here talking to you today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I did write down all of the titles, everyone who is watching, so I will also include that in the email. I was frantically typing. But thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. Thank you to Kevin for taking the time and teaching us how to up our game in the cocktail world and allow us to be a little bit fancier once we can have people over again. But yeah, with that, have a great night, everyone. I will be sending a follow-up email with all of the information that we talked about tonight, as well as a survey, and we really appreciate for any feedback that you have for us. All right, thank you.
Everybody, thanks for having me.